It's okay, Professor, you can start.
Okay, thank you, Diego, and thank you for being here, everyone. It's my pleasure and honor to hopefully educate you on how to combine exercises for maximal muscle growth. And as hopefully you all know, the manipulation of program variables is an important factor in terms of getting the most out of your training for all muscular adaptations, and certainly hypertrophy is no exception. And exercise selection will have a very large effect on your overall growth. Now, certainly you can get significant muscle growth simply by doing the same basic exercises over and over. However, you will not maximize your physique from a muscular standpoint. And what I will do today is lecture you and educate you on how to go about these principles, how to effectively incorporate varying exercise selection to maximize growth. I will also say that what I'm going to provide to you is basically a template. Certainly there is no one routine. No one can give an exact routine, say, these are the key exercises. What I would say is that there's no such thing as a bad exercise, only poor choice of exercise for a given individual. So with that said, let's get going. Oops, I think I have to. There we go. So if you want to get big, you need to lift smart. And certainly, like I said, you can get big just by doing almost anything when you're just starting out. Over time, your body is going to plateau. And lifting smart, meaning taking a science-based approach, as I'll discuss, is imperative to get results. And the harder it is for you to get gains, some people we know there are certain genetic factors that are involved, but the harder that it is for you to achieve gains, if you're a hard gainer like this little guy is at this point on the left here, you need to be scientific about it and smart about it. So let's talk a little about that. Well, how do most people get their information? It's generally through other guys in the gym. It's what we call bro science. And I'll give you a little story. When I first was starting out, this was back in the 90s, early 90s, actually probably late 80s, actually. Early 90s, I got my information from Joe Weider magazines, from the fitness magazines, like Muscle and Fitness Flex, and there was also Muscular Development, Muscle Mag. Those were, at that time, those were the biggies. And I would wait till I'd have subscriptions to these magazines, and I couldn't wait to get the next issue and learn about the new routines of the pros. And they would all have different routines. Some would have higher volume, some would have lower volume, some would have more reps, higher reps. But the exercises themselves, they would talk about why certain exercises were the best, and I would devour them. I have to try this exercise or that exercise because Lee Haney was doing it, or Lee Labrada, or Sean Ray. But most of the information we get, and including that from these magazines, would be what's termed bro science. These people are getting their information handed down from others, and it's basically, hey, this works for me. So what is bro science? My good friend and colleague Alan Aragon was actually quoted in the Urban Dictionary. And his definition is, bro science is the predominant brand of reasoning in bodybuilding circles. It could be powerlifting as well, but it's basically in gym circles where the anecdotal reports of jack dudes are considered more credible than scientific research. And I love his somewhat exaggerated example here is, bro, you got to slam 40 to 60 grams of waxy maize plus 20 grams of BCAA within 7 seconds of finishing your last set of squat rack curls. Otherwise, you go straight catabolic. And I can actually hear Alan saying that. And that, of course, is an exaggeration, but not that far off what you hear some bros say in the gym. I've heard things not too far off from that claim made. And Here's some bro logic. Concentration curls work the biceps peak. I'm sure you've probably heard that. Arnold used to say that, hey, I get the peak from working, I do concentration curls to really work the peak. Tilapia thins the skin. That's a funny one that I know Phil Heath, current Mr. Olympia, clings to. High reps are for cutting. Yo, bro, high reps. I'm in my cutting phase. I'm doing high reps. And I remember when I was teaching a course, a lower level college course, and one of my students said this to me. He said, oh, high reps, that's for cutting. And I said, well, why do you say that? Show me the evidence. I said, it's fine if you want to debate the evidence. And he obviously cannot produce any evidence. He just says, well, everyone knows that. And not everyone. Everyone might think that, or a lot of people might think that from bro science, but certainly that is not something that has been substantiated through science. And why? So look, when the skinny guy who's just starting out training goes into the gym, who is he going to go to? Is he generally going to go to the exercise science guy? No, he's going to go to the biggest guy in the gym, jack guy with 22-inch biceps and a 55-inch chest, and he's going to say, hey, how do you look like that? And, the big dude in the gym is going to say, yo, bro, I do concentration curls for my biceps and tilapia to thin the skin and high reps for my cuts. But this is a picture of Dorian Yates, who you guys might know. He's a former multi-time Mr. Olympia. Really kind of set the standard for mass during the mid to late 90s and kind of brought in a different era of bodybuilding. And you could say, hey, look at Dorian, why not just follow his training approach? Well, first of all, this was Dorian within a few months of when he started training. Now, he's more jacked. I assume he probably was natural at that point, but he's more jacked here than most guys, or many guys I know that have been training for many years. He's jacked and he's shredded. So obviously he had very good genetics. He also did have very good pharmacology. We know sometimes they call these Mexican supplements, maybe Dominican supplements you could call them as well. If you're a natural bodybuilder and you're not taking the Mexican supplements, you're not going to achieve the same gains as those who are. And when you combine the two, when you combine genetics and pharmacology, it makes a big difference. So this was Dorian, I'll get this out of the way here, but this is Dorian in his competitive days. And look at the left and look at the right. Do you think that was all from his hard training? I mean, certainly some of it was. There's no question Dorian trained very hard, and he actually was an astute trainer of the science. He did look to some extent into what research did show. But let's face it, his genetics and his pharmacology was a large contributor to how he looked. And simply doing, if you did, the vast majority of people, 99.9%, would do what Dorian did. Certainly 100% if you never did the pharmacology. But even with that, you would never look like Dorian just because of his genetics. He's an outlier. So that takes us to what are the sources of knowledge. And this is a very important point that I always like to go over when you're trying to assess how to go about approaching a given topic. Really, this should be any topic in life in general, but certainly when it comes to exercise, nutrition, this does follow. And it's called the hierarchy of knowledge. And this is a pyramid that I adopted from a book by Courtney and Watkins, the evidence-based approach, evidence-based practice book, an excellent book for those who want to look at it. And at the very bottom, so the base source of knowledge is tradition. It's like your mom told you to drink chicken soup when you had a cold, and that's because her mom did, and that's because her mom did before that. So Ultimately, you keep drinking chicken soup down the line because it's tradition. And does it have validity? Well, maybe, but maybe not. It's not something that has been necessarily handed down because of any inherent supporting evidence, just anecdotal evidence that this is what people believe based upon various reasons. It's certainly similar in exercise. When you look at split routines, the vast majority is 90+% of people or more, well over 90% of hard training competitive bodybuilders use a split routine. Why? Well, it's really at this point tradition. It's because I think everything dates back to Arnold. Arnold did it. There had to be a reason for it. And then after Arnold, Lee Haney took over and he used the split routine, and then Dorian did, and so on and so on. But tradition is very limited. Tradition, just because has been used, does not necessarily mean it is the best way to go about doing things. And we should know that Christopher Columbus, who discovered America, he was told the world was flat. Everyone told him that he was going to sail off the end of the world and die if he tried to find America. At least that's how the legend goes. And why? Because that was tradition. Of course, he proved them wrong. So the next level of knowledge is authority. And authority, in general, denotes that there is some level of education involved. So that's someone who has a degree, usually, in the field, and thus has been promoted to an authority level. Now, authority is subjective, first of all. What constitutes an authority? That would be up to the given individual to decide. I've heard some people claim that certain people were authorities, and I do not look at them as authorities. So while having a degree certainly does generally put you in a higher stead to provide knowledge, to educate, certainly not always. And even within people who are very highly knowledgeable on a topic, there can be fairly wide discrepancies in how they view the given literature on the topic. So if you were to listen to two authorities talk about protein intake, let's say, you might get quite different recommendations. We next go to trial and error. So trial and error simply is you try something and see if it works, and if not, try something else. Well, that is a very viable technique. The first thing, though, is that if you're just using trial and error, where is your starting point? So if you're starting from a complete lack of knowledge, you can just start trying something. It's going to take you a long time, probably, to find what the best way to start would be. So we generally want to start using certain guidelines. We want to start from the highest point possible, and that's where the higher levels of evidence will come in. Once you have the higher levels of evidence, trial and error is a very effective means to optimize for a given individual. So we then go to logical reasoning. Well, trial and error should be based on logical reasoning. If something isn't logical, if I would say that running, I'm going to have someone run 20 miles a day to get huge. I would hope that everyone would say, well, that's probably poor logical reasoning, and so if you started that way with trial and error, that would be a pretty dumb approach, because logical reasoning would dictate, just based on the principle of specificity, that would not maximize results, and in fact, it probably is going to hamper results. But just because, so you then look, what would be logical? And you'd say, well, lifting heavy things probably is logical, because principle of specificity would say that would maximize gains. Based on that, you would then hopefully go to the final level and the highest level of evidence, which is the scientific method. Because just because something is logical does not necessarily make it so. And in fact, lifting the heaviest things by itself does not necessarily produce the greatest hypertrophy. In fact, is not optimal for hypertrophy. So if you just do 1 rep maxes, it's not generally a good way to achieve hypertrophy. If anything, it's extremely inefficient, but probably you will not be able to achieve the sufficient volume to maximize the growth response. And that's why we go to the scientific method. And what is the scientific method? It is an objective, systematic approach to look at a given topic. And ideally, in the scientific method, we take two groups or more, but it depends on what you're studying. But let's just, on a basic level, look at two groups, and you try to manipulate one variable. So if you want to look at whether heavy versus light loads maximize hypertrophy, you want to keep everything else constant. And assuming you do, assuming that the sets are the same, the effort involved is the same, et cetera, you can then conceivably draw a cause-effect relationship. You can determine whether one actually is better than the other. So you don't necessarily always have controlled evidence. And in the absence of evidence, you will then, when I say evidence, controlled evidence, you go down to the next source of logic, of knowledge, which would be logical reasoning and so forth. So with that as background, let's talk about what is an evidence-based approach. So an evidence-based approach is not just looking at the research. While the scientific method is a beautiful way and the highest level of evidence, science is never going to tell us what to do in an applied science, such as exercise or nutrition, and other applied sciences as well. You cannot just look at science. There's too many gaps. There's too many issues with research that, including individual differences, first and foremost, that basically research will give you the mean results on a given individual, and it does not take into account the inter-individual variability that occurs. So when I carry out a study, there will be very distinct and vast differences in how people respond. And thus, we need to not only look at, we do first need to look at what science says, so that is the best current evidence, is what science says. That should be used as a guideline. So we defer to the evidence, and when we talk about the evidence, we have to look at the totality of evidence. We don't just cherry pick. That's an unfortunate thing, is that preconceived biases, what we want to believe, sometimes is trumped, and some people will just look for the research that supports their opinions. You need to take the totality of evidence into account, the best current evidence, and then synthesize that, say, hey, what does this say? And look at the quality of the studies, the overall results, and you look at who the studies were carried out in, etc. Once you have that, you then look at personal expertise. And as far as personal expertise goes, that is your own, only you will have personal expertise. So personal expertise is going to be different from individual to individual. Your experiences will shape how you go about training. So if you take the top 20 trainers in the world, if there could ever be such a thing, but let's say 20 of the top trainers, and you give them a client to train, there'll be a lot of similarities, generally speaking, but there'll also be differences based on their personal expertise. Assuming you're taking the best current evidence into account, there is no necessarily one right way to go about it. You would never know. And what's most important then is to take individual needs and abilities into account. People are all different. As I mentioned before, when I carry out a study, there will be vast differences in how people respond. You might have in the same group of subjects doing the same exact routine. One person got 20% growth in their biceps and another person got 2%. What that would suggest to me is not that one is necessarily better than the other or has better genetics. Certainly that might be a logical conclusion, but it also might mean that you need to do something differently for that person that only had 2%. And once we combine that, that is an evidence-based approach. It's the synthesis of these three factors: the best current evidence, personal expertise, and individual needs and abilities. So with that in mind, let's understand that training is both a science and an art. But everyone wants to be an artist. The thing is, you cannot disassociate the art from its underlying science. You must base what you have on the existing evidence, whatever that might be. And that's, we talked about trial and error, that's going to allow you to start from a higher baseline. And then you can employ trial and error approaches to the individual to optimize their own individual results. Now, let's apply this to exercise selection. So, some of the things to take into account, there are some people that would suggest, hey, just do squats and your big 3 exercises, and that's all you need to do. Squats, deadlifts, and presses. That is not going to get you to maximize your hypertrophy. Certainly you can get big doing that. There's no question that that will increase hypertrophy in most people. But it's not going to maximize muscle growth, and there's certainly good evidence why. Number one, this, by the way, a lot of this info here is right out of one of my favorite papers. This is by Jose Antonio. It's now in Nova in Florida. And he wrote this paper as a review for the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research back in 2000. Just a really cool paper if you want to get your hands on this. It's, I believe you can get this online for free. But when he went into the discrepancies and why you need to train in using multiple exercises. And number one, muscles often have diverse attachments, we'll talk about, that help to optimize leverage. Number two, fibers don't necessarily span the entire length of a muscle. I'll get to this in a second. And activation patterns differ based on the movement that's employed. And you know what, actually, before moving on, I think we should talk about this to a greater extent. So when we say that muscles often have diverse attachments, you look at them, and we'll get into this more when we talk about the specific muscles, but let's say the trapezius muscle, it's separated into the upper, mid, and lower aspects, and they have distinct actions that are carried out to target each of these areas. So if you want to work the upper traps, you're not going to use the same exercises that work the lower traps. Same muscle, but they're actually opposite movements, where one is depression, the other is elevation for the lower versus upper, respectively, aspects. That fibers don't necessarily span the entire length of a muscle, that to me is a really cool finding. It's been shown, let's say the rectus abdominis, the fibers are not, while they technically the entire muscle attaches from the sternum to the pubis, the individual fibers are separated. They are not consistent throughout the entire length of the muscle, and they're separated by the tendinous inscriptions. And they're actually not only separated by these inscriptions, but the upper and lower aspects are innervated by different nerves. And that gives credence to using a multi-angled approaches we'll talk about. And finally, activation patterns can differ based on a given movement. So simply changing hand positions can alter activation patterns. So let's talk about this a little. Here are the strategies that I'm going to discuss. First is training angle. Next are the planes of movement. Then we have active insufficiency versus passive tension. Then we have accentuated region of force production. That's kind of a cool one. You have hand position, limb spacing, and multi versus single joint exercise. So with that in mind, let's talk about each of these specifically. So first, let's talk about the training angle. So it's important to understand that fibers contract optimally when they're placed in a direct opposition to gravity along the direction of the fiber. What does this mean? Well, if we do an exercise where the fibers are specifically in line with the direction of gravity, which of course we know always goes down, and I'll illustrate this shortly, they would have a greater effect on that muscle as far as the activation of that muscle. Whereas if they were not in line with the direction of gravity, they would be not activated to the same extent. So, most people think that the shoulder press, so this is basically a shoulder press, barbell shoulder press. Most people think, maybe perhaps you do too, that this is a total delta exercise. And by the way, it is certainly all the three heads of the delts. There's a frontal head, a lateral head, middle head, and a posterior head. All of them are targeted in this, or all of them are active. But what part of the delt actually opposes gravity? It is the front part. As you can see, when this young lady is lifting the weight, the front delt is what is most active. So, how does this relate to training? Well, if you're going to do a lateral raise, you want to internally rotate. So you want to turn your thumb down. I like to use the phrase pouring milk. Your pinky should be higher than the thumb. In this way, the lateral delt, the middle delt, is what is directly opposing gravity. If your thumb is higher than your pinky, as this is how a lot of people do perform the exercise, what's going to happen? Well, unfortunately, your frontal delt is going to take over. And unless there are better ways to target the front delt. If you want to do a front delt exercise, I would not recommend doing a lateral raise for that. Similarly, we can target the pectorals by understanding the differences in where placing the muscle in a line of gravity. So, as we know, the sternal head, there's two basic heads. Hopefully we know this. We have the sternal head of the pecs, which is, as you can see, much larger than the other head, which is the clavicular head. So the clavicular head lies above the sternal head. Clavicular head, of course, attaches to the clavicle. This is the clavicle here. And the sternal head attaches to the sternum. It's also important to look at how the fibers are oriented in the pec. So first we have the fibers of the clavicular head, which run fairly straight to some extent to the clavicle. But look at the sternal head. Look at how the lower fibers here are rainbowed down kind of, and the upper fibers are directed kind of upward over here. So there's kind of a mid portion of the sternum and sternal head and a lower portion of the sternal head. Well, that does give us ways to target them. How can we target the different heads? Well, the clavicular head can be targeted by using an incline. Notice how on the incline, the upper portion of the chest, which would be the clavicular head, would be in a greater direction to oppose gravity. Now, my general recommendation is to use an incline of about 40 degrees or so, 35, 40 degrees, which would be enough to put the clavicular head under gravity to optimize its position in terms of gravity, but not too high that the frontal delts are going to really take over. Certainly, there is going to be front delt involvement. Your anterior delt will have sufficient involvement here. But when you start going above, let's say, the 50, 45, 50, I've seen some people even do like a 60-degree chest press, the front delts become more and more active as the bench becomes more upright as you increase the degrees in the incline. So I think a 35 to 40 degree bench incline is about optimal for most people here to target the clavicular head. The middle portion of the sternal head would be targeted from a flat bench, as that is going to be directly in line with gravity. And if you want to really try to target the lower fibers of the pecs, which you can kind of see in here, well, you can't see them, but you can see how they would be targeted. Remember, they kind of orient downward to a certain extent. Well, gravity now would be more in line with those lower fibers. So combining these exercises, and by the way, I do want to note a couple of things. This is so important. Number one, it's not that you're just getting the clavicular head here or just getting the lower fibers. You're getting all the pecs, all the fibers to some extent. It's just that you're getting a greater targeting of the fibers. You are shifting the emphasis of the work to the upper here, the mid portion of the sternal head here, and the lower portion of the sternal head here. Very important to understand. So you're not isolating the clavicular head, you are just targeting it. That's number one. And number two, and also extremely importantly, it doesn't mean that you have to include all these in the same workout. I'm going to discuss the exercises, how to include them. How they go about being included in the workout is very up in the air. There is no one right answer for that. You could do them in the same workout. You could do them, a lot would depend on how you're structuring your workout. You could, if you're doing a total body workout, you might structure Monday, Wednesday, Friday. They could be done upper or clavicular head once week one, flat bench, so incline week one, flat bench week two, and decline week three. But there's no, I cannot give you, I can give you certain guidelines, but as I said, that would be your expertise coming into play. Research can never tell you a best way to go about programming. It can just give you insights into how programming should be oriented. So let's move on to planes of movement. And recruitment will change based upon the planes of movement that you are employing. I mentioned before the trapezius, which we'll discuss, has three, it's separated into three components. Your upper, it's really not, they're not considered different heads, but they're just considered different aspects of the same muscle. So if you want to target the trapezius, remember if we're talking the trapezius, it's the back, but you'd also look at your lats being involved in that movement. Your rhomboids would also be involved in back movements. They can be targeted just based on your three planes. So what are the planes of movements? Hopefully a review that you already know, but in case you don't, we have the transverse plane, which separates the body into upper and lower halves. So we can slice the body, as you can see in this first image here. We slice the body in half, going from a horizontal standpoint. So we make a horizontal slice throughout the body. If you ever get a chance, go to the bodies exhibit. I don't know, certainly this is in America. I believe it's a worldwide show, and really fascinating. These are actual bodies that were donated to science, and they actually have a body, they have bodies that are sliced, literally segmented into transverse, frontal, and sagittal planes. So you see what a body looks like, the transverse. So this one, they have, I assume it's in all of them, but they have a body that's sliced every 6 inches or so. So you can see the transverse slices going sequentially up the skeleton. When I say skeleton, it's actually a preserved carcass. So the transverse plane are movements that take place when it's called the horizontal plane as well, where the body is moving in this plane, in the horizontal plane. Frontal is separating the body into front and back segments. So the front part of your body versus the back part of your body. It's all movements that can happen in this plane. And the sagittal plane separates the body into right and left halves. So the slice goes straight through vertically. I think the planes of movement is best illustrated in the deltoids. So as we know, the deltoids has three basic heads. You have your anterior head, sits in the front. The middle head, also called the lateral head, which is on the side. Some people even call it the side head. And the posterior head, or the rear delt, which is in the back. And as you can see, they are distinct, although they're considered as one, the deltoid, they are distinct muscles. So the deltoid, they will be separated, literally almost like separate muscles here. And the interesting thing is that each head has its own specific action. So each head has a specific task that it is given to carry out movement in the human body. The frontal head, sorry. So the frontal head, which I did not put here, targets the anterior delt. I'm sorry, the sagittal plane targets the anterior delt. And that would be like a front raise. So the function of the anterior delt is shoulder flexion, which is carried out in the frontal plane. By the way, I'll also add that even though the frontal delt can be targeted by a front raise, I generally don't recommend doing those because the anterior delt, and this is another thing you have to keep in mind when choosing exercises, the anterior delt gets a huge amount of ancillary work. So when you do chest presses, when you do, like I said, a shoulder press, when you do a fly, the anterior delt is going to be involved in virtually all chest movements and shoulder pressing movements. So it tends to be overdeveloped vis-a-vis the other two heads. So my general rule is, unless there's a overriding reason to do a front delt raise, don't do it, because you always want to look at symmetry. You don't want to overdo it. We also have if we want to target, I mentioned this before, we have the lateral delt that can be targeted from a lateral raise. It's the middle delt. And notice how in this picture, the woman is turning she's internally rotating, she's turning her pinky up, thumb down, kind of pouring milk, as you can see, to target that lateral head. So this head now opposes gravity. But the lateral head is responsible for abduction of the shoulder joint with an internally rotated shoulder. And the rear head, as you can see here, look how that's directly opposing gravity. The rear head is responsible for horizontal abduction. So this is horizontal abduction, and that is from a bent position, lifting the weights up. And of course, you could do this on machines. There are machines like a lateral raise machine, a rear delt machine that can accomplish the same task. But this is in the frontal plane. This is in the transverse plane. As I mentioned, the front raise would be in the sagittal plane. Similarly, the back musculature, as I mentioned before, also would be targeted through different planes of movement. So some of the back musculature that we look at would be the trapezius. Now notice the trapezius, as I mentioned, it's not really separate heads, but notice how fibers have different directions here. So the direction of the trapezius, this is the upper portion, goes up. The mid portion goes straight and the lower portion goes down. Well, the upper portion, as you can see here, is targeted by, this would be a scapular elevation, so this would be like a shrug. The mid portion here would be targeted by adduction of the shoulder girdle, so bringing the shoulder girdle together. And the lower aspect would be scapular depression. So this would actually, and they also call this retraction, the adduction of the scapula, the scapular retraction. We also, of course, have the rhomboids, which are targeted here, and then some other muscles, and of course the lats as well in the back. So a large, very large amount of muscle mass, as you can see here. Well, they can be targeted, so the back can also be targeted from different planes of movement. This is the frontal plane. This really targets the lats. This is called shoulder adduction, and that targets the lat musculature. Also will get the lower portion, because there's scapular depression. We'll get the lower portion of the trapezius as well. Here you're going to really get your rhomboids and mid-traps. This is a sagittal plane movement, a seated row in the sagittal plane. So notice how she's keeping her elbows close to the body. That's what makes this the sagittal plane. And that's going to get, like I said, it's going to get the lats as well, but also target the rhomboids and the mid-traps. And here again, this is a wide grip row. So the lats are going to be less involved here. And you're going to get more focus on the rhomboids, the mid-traps, and also your posterior deltoid will get involved here as well. So again, you see three different, this is sagittal, this is frontal plane, sagittal plane, and transverse plane, all can be included. And again, you don't need to do these in the same day. Be aware that these can be structured not necessarily any way, but multiple ways throughout the course of a routine. And how about the lower body? Well, we know that the front part of the thigh has a diverse array of musculature. You have your quads, you have your vastus medialis, your lateralis, and your rectus femoris. Vastus intermedius lies underneath the rectus femoris. But we also have our sartorius, our gracilis. Of course, we're going to have our adductors in here as well, which are not noted, but there's the adductors. This actually is, oops, this, I believe it got cut off. This would be an adductor. Again, you can work the thighs in different planes of movement. So lunge in the frontal plane, so this is just a regular, the lunge in the sagittal plane, this is the frontal plane here. The lunge in the sagittal plane is going to target more in the frontal thigh, the quadriceps musculature. Certainly other muscles become involved. And here, in this photo, the adductors, she's now doing a side lunge, lateral lunge, and that's in the frontal plane, and that means your adductors will become involved to a greater extent. So hopefully, as you can see, simply varying the plane of movement can result in substantially different interactions between muscles, and thus combining them properly will maximize development of the entire musculature. Next, let's talk about active insufficiency and passive tension. And this, to me, is a really cool concept. I wrote about this years ago in the Strength and Conditioning Journal. It's been quite a popular paper. It was almost 15 years ago that I published that paper. But I had learned about this concept through several of my mentors back in the day. And it just really intrigued me how you can actually make a muscle more or less active based upon stretching or shortening it. And active insufficiency is when a two-joint muscle, and these are all two-joint muscles, so it can only be, active insufficiency can only be carried out in a two-joint muscle. As well as, by the way, passive tension as well. So active insufficiency is when a two-joint muscle is slackened at one end, so it's shortened at one end, and it is then acted upon at the other end. I'll give you examples of this to hopefully make this more clear, since being in a webinar prevents me from actually demonstrating it myself. But I think you'll see how this relates. So you have a two-joint muscle that is shortened at one end and then acted upon at the other, and that would be actively insufficient. On the other hand, passive tension is when you stretch a muscle at one end, a two-joint muscle at one end, and then act upon at the other. So active insufficiency will make a two-joint muscle less active. Passive tension will make a two-joint muscle, biarticular muscle, more active. Here is an illustration of why this is the case. When you shorten a muscle like this, as you can see, this is a muscle that's shortened. It's already somewhat shortened, so trying to shorten it more with another action, so another exercise when you're carrying it out, let's say you've shortened it here, there's not as much room for it to shorten. On the other hand, when a muscle is at resting length, they're actually slightly greater. So roughly 120% resting length has been shown in some studies to be its optimal length to carry out an action. It actually has its maximal ability to shorten and thus can create greater force. When a muscle is excessively shortened, now this can be difficult to achieve, but a muscle that is excessively shortened, it's beyond the realm of being able to shorten. As you can see, it's not in a good leverage state for all the sarcomeres all the contractile elements, the actins, to bind to the myosin. I think the most, I wouldn't say most common, but certainly one of the easiest ways to envision this is with the calves, and certainly one of the most applicable ways to employ the active tension, the passive tension active insufficiency is in the calf muscles, in working the calves. Your gastrocnemius, so the gastrocnemius is a two-joint muscle. It's called a biarticular muscle. As you can see, here's the gastroc. It attaches at the above the knee, so it attaches at the femur, and then it goes into the Achilles tendon at the ankle joint. So it attaches at the ankle, and then it attaches above the knee at the femur. Thus, it has two functions. It has a function at the knee, since it crosses the knee. Of course, it's going to have a function there. Its function at the knee is to flex the leg. So it's knee flexion. And of course, it also has a function at the ankle joint, given its attachment at the Achilles. And that, of course, is plantar flexion, simple calf raise. The soleus, on the other hand, as you can see, does not cross the knee joint. It attaches on the lower aspect of the leg. And it, too, then attaches in the Achilles, just like it fuses to the same attachment here as the soleus. So how is this applicable to training? Well, if you carry out a bent leg calf raise, is already flexed at the knee. So the gastroc is going to be somewhat shortened at this point, right? Because the function of the gastrocnemius is to Bend the knees to flex the knee. So this already has shortened the gastroc. Now if you do a calf raise, the gastroc is already shortened. It has a limited capacity to shorten further. Thus, how are you going to accomplish the action? Well, the soleus will take over to a greater extent. Alternatively, a straight leg calf raise, as you can see, the knee is straight here. The gastroc then is in its resting position. It is now stretched, and thus it can carry out this action with full force. And thus the gastroc will be highly active here. So combining these two movements, a straight leg and a bent leg, will hopefully optimize, or at least conceivably optimize, the development of both the soleus and the gastroc. Another muscle that can be where you can employ active insufficiency and passive tension is the triceps. So the long head of the triceps, as you can see, crosses the glenohumeral joint, crosses the shoulder here, whereas the lateral and medial heads do not. They attach at the humerus. All three heads will cross the elbow joint and attach at the ulna. So the three tricep heads is hopefully, we know there's three. There's the lateral, medial, and long heads. Only the long head crosses the shoulder joint. So the long head is a two-joint muscle. It is a biarticular muscle. Whereas the medial and lateral heads are uniarticular. So how can we target the different heads? Well, when you do an exercise where so I should mention here too, this is important, the long head of the triceps, we know all three heads of the triceps do do elbow extension. But the long head also does shoulder extension as well. So the long head is a shoulder extensor. Basically, it brings the arm down from an up position. And all three of them are elbow extensors. So here, you can see like in a kickback, the shoulder is in an extended position. It's already brought down from a flexed position, so it's extended. What does this mean? Well, the long head will be shortened here. And then if you're now trying to carry out this action, the kickback action, so elbow extension, it's not going to have the ability to shorten much more. What happens? Thus, the other two heads, the lateral and medial heads, will take over to a greater extent. On the other hand, when you stretch, so here now the shoulder is flexed. What happens when the shoulder is flexed? Well, the long head of the triceps is now in a stretched position, so it has a greater capacity to carry out force. And thus, when you carry out the extension of the elbow with the long head stretched, you will get greater activation of that muscle. So, bottom line here would be to do exercises both that stretch the long head, so a overhead type exercise, as well as exercises that put the long head in a shortened position, where the elbows are at the sides or even behind the body, as you see here in the kickback. So a press down would be similar, triceps push down, press down, kickback. Those would be exercises that would promote some active insufficiency of the long head and thus target more in the lateral and medial heads. This is kind of a cool one, accentuated region of force production. So here the direction of the human body relative to space results in varying degrees of torque throughout a given exercise. I actually wrote a paper on this with my good friend and colleague Brett Contreras, where we talked about how this comes into play. The glutes are a good way to look at this. So the glutes, we know we have the gluteus medius, you have gluteus maximus, the medius, and the minimus. Basically 3 aspects of the glutes. Now, this comes right out of the article that I co-authored with my colleague Brett Contreras. I encourage you all to check this one out. This was published in the Strength and Conditioning Journal. It was titled, "Are All Hip Extension Exercises Created Equal?" Are all hip extension exercises created equal? And the answer, maybe you guessed it, is no. So these are curves, these are strength curves that we modeled based on different exercises. So the horizontal back extension, this is when 90 degrees, 135 degrees, and 180 degrees. At 90 degrees, the horizontal back extension has very little hip torque, whereas at 180 degrees, there is extensive torque in the hip extensors. In the 45-degree back extension, you see it starts out at 90 degrees to be somewhat low, then gets progressively higher to its maximum at 135 degrees, and then again trails off at 180. And the good morning has basically the exact opposite curve of the horizontal back extension, where the torque is very high at 90 degrees of hip flexion, and at 180 degrees, it's extremely low. So how does that look? Here you go. Here is your good morning. So here, your glutes are now highly stretched, highly active, right? They're under load in a stretched position. Here is where, same thing, in the 45-degree press, where you're achieving your maximal load. And here is where the maximal torque is in the regular hip extension, in the regular back extension exercise. Next are changes in hand position. So this, and as hopefully you can start seeing that not all of these strategies work with every muscle group. You have to look at the different muscle groups and understand how each one of these applies. So the biceps really cannot be trained in different planes of movements. It would be your shoulder can move into different planes of movements when you're training the biceps, but elbow flexion always takes place in the sagittal plane. So you can move around your shoulder, which again potentially can alter adaptations, but that is not the plane of movement of the biceps itself, of the elbow, cannot be changed. So understand that. And this applies to many exercises. But alterations in hand position can alter muscular activation. And that's where the biceps would be really one of the most, when I say the biceps, the elbow flexors really would be, and the biceps are one of the elbow flexors, would be a prime example of this. So the elbow flexors, there's multiple, but the primary ones are the biceps brachii, that's what everyone thinks of, the biceps. But we also have the brachialis, which sits underneath the biceps, and brachialis is actually quite a large muscle. So very important to train. And we also have the brachioradialis, which is, of course, an important muscle. So we have the brachioradialis as well. So by the way, so to go through this, the biceps brachii, if you don't know, they're all elbow flexors, but the biceps brachii has its greatest activation when the arm is supinated. So when the arm is in supination. The brachioradialis is going to have its greatest effect when the hand position is in neutral position. And the brachialis is going to have its greatest impact when the hand position is in pronated position. So here is supination. Basically, that's a palm facing up. And this is wrist rotation, would be the term for it. At the wrist, the neutral at the wrist would be a neutral grip. So where the hand is facing, kind of like if you were going to clap. And when the hands are facing down, the palms are facing down, that would be pronation of the hand. Well, how does this translate into different results? In the far left, the biceps brachii are going to be most involved, as this young lady is curling the weight in a supinated position. So a supinated curl, and by the way, you can actually feel this for yourself. I'll ask, so since I can't see you guys, I'll ask that you do this. So supinate your hand, and then flex your arm as hard as possible. So do this with me now. So put your hand into a supinated position and flex it as hard as you can. Basically do like a biceps pose, if you will. And now put your finger on your biceps. Feel the muscle. Hopefully it should. If you've been doing your elbow flexion exercises, hopefully it's a pretty good biceps at this point. You can really feel that. Now just do that a few times. So go unflex and then flex and feel what happens. Okay? Now, turn your wrist, rotate your wrist so that you are now pronating your wrist. So that the wrist is in the palm is in the exact opposite position of what you did before. Rotate the wrist. And now do the same thing and feel your biceps. Feel how it's nowhere near as peaked as it was in the supinated position. That's because the biceps, how the wrist rotates, how the biceps attaches to the radius, how it rotates around the radius during the supination will maximize its involvement, and it doesn't rotate to the same extent when you pronate. So when you pronate, as on the right here, you will target the brachialis. Why? Well, the brachialis it attaches at the ulna. So it is, as opposed to the biceps, which attach at the radius, the brachialis attaches at the ulna. So it does not have any effect based on the wrist rotation. It's kind of like an act of insufficiency, almost. So while the biceps brachii is less active, the brachialis must take over to accomplish that work. So you can target the brachialis simply by doing pronated curls. And in the middle, the neutral grip is targeting the brachioradialis, which has its greatest activation when the hands are in neutral position. Now, limb spacing. Limb spacing is a often underutilized technique. So that's where you take a wider or narrower grip or stance, either a grip on the bar or stance on the floor. And a cool illustration here is the squat. So on the left is kind of a sumo squat, and on the right is a fairly close stance squat. So a sumo, you are spreading out your thighs and then turning your toes slightly outward, and this is going to target more the adductors, the adductors. And also you're going to tend to get greater glute involvement because you do tend to get greater hip extension throughout this. But simply the stance itself will put the adductors in a greater stretch and thus a greater capacity to carry out movement here to be activated. On the other hand, and both of these will get somewhat similar, if not very similar, thigh activation, quadricep activation. Here, you're getting greater involvement in the soleus, particularly the plantar plexus, particularly the soleus, when it's a narrow stance. So again, simply just utilizing different limb spacing strategies will have an effect. Here you get the adductors, here the gastroc, and the soleus. It's similar in the bench press. So you have a narrow grip, a medium grip, and a wide grip. In the narrow grip, you're going to tend to get more involvement of the triceps. So a narrow grip tends to get more triceps involved. You can see his hands here, the figure's hands here are close to the body. Why? Because the pecs are less stretched. So some of these are kind of interactive. We talked about active insufficiency, passive tension, active insufficiency. This kind of goes somewhat into that realm here. So the less stretch on the pecs provides greater output from the triceps to carry out the move. Where the wider grip will tend to get more pectoral involvement. A lot of people do not think about the multi-versus single joint movements effect on muscle growth. And this is a very important concept. So we know multi-joint movements are those that more than one joint are active in a movement. So squats, rows, presses, deadlifts, all of those are multi-joint movements, actual deadlifts. As on the other hand, single joint moves is where there's only action through one joint. A stiff-legged deadlift would be, as opposed to a regular deadlift, would be an example of single versus multi, where the single joint is the stiff-legged because only the hip joint is moving. Whereas in a regular deadlift, the hip, the knee, and to some extent the ankle joints are all working. There's been a lot of discussion as to whether single joint exercises are even necessary for doing multi-joints. I will say that research from our lab certainly shows, let's say in the biceps, you get substantial activation in the biceps, and substantial development, not only activation, which we've shown, but also development. Let's say doing a lat pull down or a seated row, and we've shown really marked muscle hypertrophy even in well-trained subjects. But the question is, if you added single joint moves, would they get any better results? And there's really not been a lot of really good studies. There's been a few that seem to question it, but I would certainly say it would depend upon the exercise and how much volume and the muscle group that you're training. So there are a bunch of it depends here, but certainly there is a need, I feel, without having hard evidence. Here's where if we go back to that the hierarchy of knowledge, I would say this is just based on logical reasoning a lot because there's kind of an absence of evidence. But I mean, take the calves. Yeah, you're going to get calf development some calf development doing a squat, but the taxation of how your muscles are challenged, the gastroc and soleus during a calf is nowhere near what it is in a calf raise, seated or standing calf raise. So certainly reason. I mentioned before about like a lateral raise to work the middle delt. Yeah, you can get, let's say an upright row will accomplish that. So could you do it with a single joint? I guess. How much more could a lateral raise give? Perhaps some. I think it probably is somewhat subtle. And if you're a bodybuilder, I think that's where or someone who just wants to get maximal muscle growth, that's where it really is going to start to pay its most dividends and have its most applicability. But again, more research is needed. But what I would say is that here's what is certain, that you can increase or decrease the activation of a given muscle based upon multi versus single joint usage. A squat certainly will work the hamstrings. No question that the squat promotes some hamstring development. However, the hamstrings really doesn't change its length that much during a squat. And the amount of development that you do get from a squat is really limited in the hamstrings. It's a biarticular muscle, and activation has been shown to be markedly less. Thus, in order to maximize hamstrings development, you need to do an isolation type movement. When I say isolation, a single joint movement. You won't really, as I talked before, you don't necessarily isolate the hamstrings, or you don't isolate any muscle. That's, by the way, a very important point to bring up. There really is no such thing as muscle isolation. There is only targeting of a given muscle. The only way you can, only muscle maybe you can isolate would be a finger, doing like a finger exercise, or maybe your eyelid. Attach some weights to an eyelid, simply because there's an interaction between muscles, that there's stabilization and other factors. So even, let's say in a hamstring curl, leg curl like this, remember the gastrocnemius is a knee flexor, so that will be involved in this exercise. You're getting gastrocnemius. You can even see here how her gastroc is active. You can see it contracting in this picture. But back to the point, to get the hamstrings, to optimally develop the hamstrings, you need to do targeted movements. So that would be like a leg curl, a stiff-legged deadlift, etc. And it's been shown that the back squat only involves about half as much EMG activity as the leg curl. So let's put this into some practical applications for you. If you want to maximize muscular development, you need to take a varied approach to exercise selection. So just doing the big three exercises is not going to provide your maximal development. You must perform a variety of movements, and how they are structured over time is variable. That's where your own expertise is going to come in. Some of the things to consider is, first of all, the spectrum of techniques available. I ran through a host of different techniques that you should look at. As mentioned, you do not necessarily have to employ them in the same routine, and often you will not. It's not possible. Part of that will depend upon how you're structuring your routine, and there is no one necessarily best way to structure a routine, and often it is beneficial to structure routines differently over the course of a period of time. If you're periodizing, you call it a cycle. Let's say a mesocycle. You want to plan the variation of exercises over time. So give it thought as to how these will best be carried out. Also understand that there is no best exercise. So you want to take the needs and abilities of the individual into account. Some people just don't like a given exercise. There's no exercise that has to be done from a hypertrophy standpoint. Now, if you want to be a power lifter, you have to do the big three exercises. If you want to be a power lifter, you're going to have to squat, you're going to have to deadlift, and you're going to have to bench press. There's no two ways about that, because those are the required lifts. But from a hypertrophy standpoint, there are many different ways to accomplish the same thing, which is overall muscular development. And no exercise is completely necessary for this. I'd also say that it's important, so I talked about different techniques. Understand there's also different modalities that can be used for the exercises. So machines versus free weights versus cables. Is there a best? No, absolutely not. And by the way, this is one of my pet peeves. They talk about functional versus non-functional. Show me a bodybuilder that can't lift the package up. And it's kind of silly. So if your goal is to be the best athlete as possible, then there's going to be specificity of exercises that you're going to have to consider. That would be a different ballgame. But if you're a bodybuilder, you will get more functional just from doing machines. Certainly machines are functional. Now, are they optimally functional for all populations? No. That would depend upon your overall goal. But from a bodybuilding type standpoint, if your goal is purely to look your best from a muscular standpoint, understand that there is a synergy between machines and free weights. So the benefits of one are the disadvantages of the other. Namely, in free weights, there's going to be a substantial activation of secondary muscles and stabilizer muscles. Is that beneficial? Yes, you want to develop those muscles. So, and it might be difficult to do them just using machines. But machines can target a given exercise by taking away the stabilization aspect. You get more involvement of the target musculature. So combining these types of exercises, using some machines and free weights, will ultimately be the best way to maximize total body development and thus muscular symmetry, which is essential for bodybuilding certainly, but just for looking your best. If your goal, I coined the term "look great naked," or I popularized it. It was based upon when I was a personal trainer back in the late 90s, and I'd get clients coming in, and 90% of my clients, they didn't care about it. They didn't come to me and say, "Dude, get me to jump higher," or "Dude, I just want to sprint as fast as possible." They were your general population, and their goals were, "I want to maximize muscle and lose body fat." And they would say, men and women would all say to me, "I just want to look great naked." And that coined the term. And that is if you're a trainer, the vast majority of your clients, they're going to be, assuming you're not training athletes, but for most personal trainers, assuming you're working with the general population, these are going to be the strategies you want to employ, because their goals are not to optimize their functional capacity. They will get more functional. Do not make no mistake. And contrary to what many people will say or have said, certain what I feel are non-informed fitness professionals, they talk about machines as being non-functional, or bodybuilding training as being non-functional. That is hogwash. That is bunk, and we've carried out studies that show this. You get more functional, no question, by doing machines. It's not going to optimize, certainly if you're talking about optimizing a given functional component, there are reasons why using exercises that take place in three-dimensional space, such as free weights and cable machines, are important, but they are not necessary to get more functional, depending upon your current level of functionality. So I just want to give a big thanks to Diamondized Nutrition, who does fund all my studies without having any say in what I publish. They basically just give me money to fund studies and then allow me to publish as I please, and whatever the results are, that's what I publish, and that epitomizes quality. So big shout out to them, because I couldn't carry out many of the studies that I do without funding and without thus their support. And that's my presentation. I will be happy to take any questions and hope you learned something.
Thank you so much, Professor Schoenfeld. Bueno, muy buenas tardes para los que están conectados aún. Si tienen alguna pregunta, por favor la podemos entonces escribir. Y